Dr. Ina Kubbe, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs at Tel Aviv University. She worked on a project about the impact of corruption and state capture on women in Central and Eastern Europe. And also, she just came back from Vienna. She's an international consultant at the United Nations in the Department of Drugs and Crime, support of the development and implementation of university modules on anti-corruption. So as you have seen, her subject is really corruption and norms. This is her latest book. She also is trying to get another paper published where I like very much the title is Why You Don't Do It. Why is corruption so low in Germany? Citizens' attitudes and norms toward corruption. So that is a forthcoming article. So Ina, we would like to welcome you very much, and we are very curious about your lecture tonight. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present my research today. I have been researching on corruption already for several years. I have written my PhD on the causes of corruption in Europe, and today I will give a talk on corruption and norms in Europe, and I will mainly answer 4 questions. The first one is, for me, easy to answer. Why is it so important to research on corruption? Secondly, why should we research on corruption in Europe? Thirdly, how do we measure actually corruption? And finally, why is it so important to research on corruption from a norm perspective, from a cultural point of view? Okay, so let's start with the first question. Why is it so important to research on corruption? Corruption is actually or generally defined as the misuse or abuse of entrusted power or public power for private gain. And of course we could have discussions about that. What does it mean, misuse? How do we define public position or entrusted power? What does it mean, private gain? But this is the definition that we are working with. So this is the definition that international organizations use, such as the World Bank or Transparency International, and this is also the common standard in academia. And I also add deliberate, because corruption never takes place just like that. So behind corruption there is always irrational behavior. So it's a crime of calculation in the end. So that's why it's important also to add this adjective. And this definition also focuses on public corruption, which doesn't mean that private corruption is excluded, because we know that the private sector and the public sector are always related with each other. So we say corruption generally occurs where private wealth and public power overlap. We know for sure, I know that there are some researchers, they don't have their opinion, but in general it's clear that corruption has detrimental effects on overall well-being. So we know that corruption is detrimental to economic, to political, to social development. So we know that corruption disturbs macroeconomic and fiscal stability, it stunts economic growth, it increases inflation, and it promotes social inequality and poverty. And we also know that corruption violates the fundamental principles of democracy, such as equality, transparency, accountability, fairness, pluralism. And we also know that corruption lowers the level of citizens' trust in political institutions and processes. So corruption really lowers institutional trust, which is very important when we talk about the rise of populism, when we talk about the rise of nationalism, the rise of radical right-wing parties and movements. And corruption also decreases the level between you and me, interpersonal trust, which is also very important when we talk about solidarity, about social equality, about social capital in general, within societies and also between societies. And we also know that corruption undercuts various dimensions of human well-being, such as health, such as education, access to clean water. And we also know that corruption, or that people that live in high-level corruption countries are less happy than people that live in countries that don't have low levels of corruption. And we also know that these consequences, that these negative consequences are found in both, in developing and in developed countries. So it's not a matter of underdeveloped countries, of authoritarian regimes, it's also a matter in democracies and in well-developed countries. So in the end, corruption is deadly and we should stop it. The next question, the second question, why is it so important to research on corruption in Europe? So people always ask me, why do you research on corruption in Europe? I mean, there are so many problems in the world. Why corruption in a region that is characterized by honest governance, by clean governance? But we know that this is not the case, because we see that almost every day in the newspapers that there are scandals on corruption. This is only what we know. For sure there are more scandals, so we know that there is, of course, a huge problem with corruption also in Europe. And the Secretary General of the Council of Europe claimed that corruption is the biggest threat to democracy in Europe today. And also the economic costs are immense. So there is a study from the European Parliament study. They revealed that corruption could cost the European economy up to 990 billion euro each year. Another factor, of course, why it's important to research on corruption in Europe is that we still little have knowledge about the area-specific factors. So we know, for example, that Italy has huge problems with corruption, but we also know that corruption in the north of Italy is totally different than the level of corruption in the south of Italy. So we know that in Europe there are large differences of corruption between the countries, within the countries, and also across time. Another argument why is it so important to research on corruption is that particularly in both new and established democracies, we have corruption really varies. So since the economic crisis in 2007, country corruption values have continuously increased in southern Europe. So in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Greece, they have really higher levels of corruption at the moment. While on the other hand, there are countries such as Estonia that really increased, so they show lower levels of corruption at the moment. And another argument is that there is no other region in the world where young democracies such as Estonia or Slovakia, well-established democracies such as the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, Sweden, as well as authoritarian regimes that also belong to Europe, are located so closely to each other, and of course countries affecting each other. So with the ending of the Cold War and the transition of communist countries to young democracies, the political, the economic and the socio-cultural transition in Europe changed considerably, also in the manifestation of corruption. So countries in Central and Eastern Europe have experienced a long political transition, also of course, and also the level of corruption in these countries affected the level of corruption in Europe as a whole. And nevertheless, another argument is that we are still looking for effective strategies against corruption in Europe, because we know some tools, we know what to do, but we are still looking for more effective strategies in the fight of corruption in Europe. The next question is, the third question, how do we measure corruption? At first, we cannot measure corruption in a direct way, and we will never be able to measure corruption because, of course, it takes place in hidden places, in unofficial settings. People that are involved, they don't want to really talk about this. So we can only measure the perception of corruption. So when I talk about later on corruption, I mean the perception of corruption. So there are several tools that we are using to measure it, but all of them have limitations. The first one, or the most common one, are surveys. So we use surveys from Transparency International, for example, the Corruption Perception Index, which was developed in 1995 by Johann Graf Lambsdorff. He's a professor of economy in Passau. And these data, I want to show you this, just that you have an impression. I'm sure some of you know this already. So here that you have an impression, so this is the world and this is the level of corruption in the world. And as you can see here, it's from 2017, because we don't have data yet for 2018, obviously. But here you can see that red means highly corrupt and green means very clean. So when we have a look here on Europe, we have all the colors. So we have Finland, 85, it's out of 100. So yellow, but we also have countries, for example, Spain, 57, Croatia, Romania or Ukraine, 30, red. And here you can see a score or a table, and the first place, as usual, is New Zealand, but you can also see that the score is 89. So there is no country in the world that reaches 100, because there will always be corruption. So there is no zero corruption level country in the world. But the good message is that New Zealand is already followed by Denmark, by Finland, Norway, Switzerland, so countries in Europe. Also that you know who's at the end of the table, and this is Somalia. So they rank 180 countries. Here you see Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan. I think we could expect that. Okay, so this is the Corruption Perception Index. The problem is we only have one score for each country, and as I told you already, we know that Italy has a different level in the north of corruption than in the south. So we should combine this survey data also with other methods and all other indices. And you can, of course, combine it with qualitative analysis, such as content analysis. Journalists are doing a great job when they research on corruption. So this you can also use. Or reports from NGOs. And you can also use experimental approaches. This is what I did now for a while, because I used the Corruption Perception Index during my PhD, so quantitative data, but I was so unsatisfied with that, because corruption takes place at the individual level between persons, but here we only have the aggregated data. So I wanted to go closer to the mechanisms, what is really happening when people behave in a corrupt way. So experiments offer also a very good approach to measure corruption. And there are also some proxy approaches. They are very creative. I wouldn't use them, but they are there, so people are still working on this, how we can measure corruption in a more efficient way or with more valid data. So for example, Golden and Picci did this 2006 in Italy. They were measuring the difference of the money the government is spending for infrastructure, and they had to look what's finally there, like streets, hospitals, and the difference between the expenses and what they really see, they measured as corruption. But it's an approach, but of course it's very hard also to compare these findings then. So we should do this, or we should conduct this research, and of course also in other countries if we want to work with comparative data, because I'm always working from a comparative perspective. Let's have here another look at the Corruption Perception Index for 2017. So here you see the level of perceived corruption. 0 means high corruption, 100 means low. So here is 100. This is Denmark, Finland, Norway, Switzerland. These are the countries that show the lowest level of corruption in Europe. And here in the end, you see Turkey, Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova, Ukraine. So this is there at the end.
Does this include Russia?
Sorry?
Does this include Russia?
If it includes Russia?
No.
No, Russia is always a special case. I usually also exclude Turkey, but for today I want this. And the average score is 60 from all of these countries. But I will show you different, also different data. It's from the Eurobarometer from 2017. The problem is with the Eurobarometer, you only have the countries that are part of the European Union. But this also gives you an impression. So while the Transparency International Index use expert data, so these are scientists, people from academia who perceive the level of corruption, this data is from citizens, so they are citizens. And what's very good is that we found a very high correlation between the perception of citizens of corruption and the perception of experts. So we can also use the data of citizens. So here you see how widespread do you think the problem of corruption is in your country. And here you can see Finland, 21%. So only 21% think that it's a problem in their country. This is here the average from the European Union, 28 countries. So it's 68. And here you see that the people who perceive the highest level of corruption in Europe is Greece. They have 96% said that they think that's a problem in their country, followed by Spain, Cyprus, Croatia, Latvia, Portugal, Italy. And there, in the majority of cases, the figure actually has fallen. Just Cyprus perceived 16% more of corruption. The other country actually improved. And here are the main findings of this Eurobarometer. The previous survey was from 2013, so they only do this every fourth year. And Europeans think that corruption is widespread among political parties and politicians, and this is also what I found out in my experiments. So when you ask people, when you ask participants, what do you associate with corruption, the majority, I did these experiments in Germany, in the US, and in Israel, all of them said government and politics. So in Europe, they also say it's among political parties and politicians the highest. 2/3 think that corruption is widespread in their country. 1/4 say that they are personally affected. But the problem is the people who are affected, they don't report it. And this is one of the biggest problems we have in Europe at the moment, actually all over the world, that people don't go to the police and that they give a report. And less than 50%, and here we see already a problem, the cause of the problem, they don't really know where to go. And also many believe that corruption goes unreported because it's difficult to prove, it will not be punished, and there is no protection for those who report corruption. And as Gisela already mentioned, I was in Vienna some days ago and I'm working in this Education for Justice program for the United Nations, and this is also one of the main topics, how to protect whistleblowers, so that people feel comfortable to report corruption. Already the fourth question. The fourth question is why is it so important research on corruption in Europe from a norm perspective, from a cultural point of view? And before I go deeper into this norm approach, I want to give you a quick overview of the theoretical and empirical approaches on corruption in general. At first, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to combat corruption completely. So as I said, we will always have problems with corruption, but at least we can try to curb it. And there are some remedies against corruption, or how I call it. So I call it the democracy argument, the sanction argument, the path dependency argument, and the cultural argument. And here's my main research focus on at the moment. And This you could also use as an analytical framework. So when you want to find out, this I use, for example, for the article on corruption in Germany. You could use it as, like a blueprint, like a framework to analyze the cause of corruption, but also to find strategies against that. Let's start with the democracy argument. So the democracy argument is the most promising one, but also the most complex one. So we know that there is a negative relationship between the level and the quality of democracy and the level of corruption. So well-established democracies show lower levels of corruption than authoritarian regimes or young democracies. However, it doesn't mean that democracy guarantees clean and transparent governments, as we can see. There are two main channels of democracy that can limit corruption, but always in conjunction also with economic circumstances. And these are formal and informal institutions. So informal institutions also refer to cultural approaches, and I'm talking now only on formal institutions. So one of the strongest effects on a country's level of corruption is the character and design of a political system and its institutions. So you can also call it institutionalism. So particularly democratic systems are characterized by the fact that the political elite is horizontally and vertically divided. So horizontal accountability refers to formal mechanisms, to checks and balances within the government, while vertical accountability refers to accountability of government to the citizens through formal mechanisms, mostly through elections. And this is also very important when we talk about elections, because democracies give their citizens a role in choosing their political leaders, so that elected officials who have been proven to be corrupt can be punished for their actions during the next elections. But this is not the case. So elections are the unique moment in which voters can punish corrupt politicians. But there is a lot of research about this that shows that voters don't do that. And this is one of the explanations why is there still so much corruption also in democracies. So one of the reasons why we still have corruption in democracies is that citizens usually do not fully exploit their rights and do not use elections to express their general discontent or punish corrupt politicians. And there are different hypotheses for that, how I call them. At first, the information assumption. So this means that voters just don't know. They have a lack of information, they have a lack of knowledge. They don't know that the candidates that they want to vote for are actually involved in corrupt scandals or involved in some dishonest actions. And also, a lot of people they are not interested in politics. A second one is the inconsistency hypothesis. We never know because citizens are not always consistent in their voting behavior. Parties and candidates hypothesis means that voters do not only consider a candidate's individual skills and performances, they also see the party. So sometimes the party is just more important than the candidate, him or herself. And another really important explanation, or one of the major explanation for voters' ignorance or forgiveness, besides the information hypothesis, is the trade-off hypothesis. So voters always do a trade-off. They do a cost-benefit analysis. So, for example, voters expect that the direct and indirect benefits from a politician's action in government will be greater than the costs associated with corruption and other illegal activities. So they perceive a trade-off between anti-corruption reforms and other desirable goals, such as increasing local welfare or attracting local investment, or in the case of Israel, protection and security. So summarizing, we can say that although elections are the best mechanism to punish political corruption, unfortunately the empirical evidence does not support the fact. Another aspect of the democracy argument is the societal accountability and social empowerment, of course, we need the citizens to fight against corruption. We need the existence of a free press, we need active journalists, the freedom of information, and we need in general a strong demanding civil society, and we need a civil society that cultivates anti-corruption commitment rules, so that corruption is not an option anymore for politicians and political leaders. And another distinction or another differentiation that Monika Bauer is doing, she's working at the Quality of Government Institute in Sweden, in Gothenburg, and I'm working with them a lot because they do amazing research on corruption. So Monika Bauer claims that citizens are more likely to engage in the fight against corruption when corruption is needed to gain access to fair treatment, as opposed to special illicit advantages, greed corruption. So we have need corruption when you actually have to bribe someone to get access to the healthcare system, to get education, when you have to bribe the doctor to get medicine, to get a treatment. This is need corruption. You have to. And on the other hand, you have greed corruption. So this is what we see at the top level government. This is the grant corruption in contrast to pity corruption. And in democracies, of course, there are exceptions. For example, in Croatia, you have to bribe sometimes the police officer, you bribe the doctor, so pity corruption. But in democracies, we have the problem is we have a bigger problem with greed corruption. But here the problem is that because citizens don't really feel it in their daily life, they are not affected, it leads to demobilization. And only need corruption leads to mobilization. And this, of course, we should also change. Citizens know that also greed corruption, of course, is damaging their trust. But here you see some pictures from Europe that, of course, there are a lot of anti-corruption protests, and when you Google anti-corruption protest demonstrations Europe, you mainly find pictures from Central and Eastern Europe. So you can see the first picture. This is in Bulgaria from January 2018, so some months ago. Here you see a picture from protesters in Kiev in front of the parliament, October 2017. And this is a picture from Romania in August 2018. So we see some civic engagement. So citizens are really frustrated about the situation, and they also want politicians and they want the government to fight against corruption. The next argument is the sanction argument, besides the democracy argument. So of course we need laws, we need rules, we need anti-corruption tools because they are necessary for monitoring and sanctioning corruption, to punish perpetrators, to create anti-corruption norms, and also, of course, to draw attention to the problem. So illegal acts must be punished to show citizens that the state and the rule of law as a pillar of democracy is functioning. And we also need to change the cost and benefit analysis. So although there are some laws, in most cases, or in some cases, they don't seem strict enough. So when we have a look, for example, also to Israel, we find also examples in Europe for sure, is there were politicians, they behaved corrupt in the past, they went to prison, they came back and they did it again. So the cost-benefit analysis, it still seemed it's still more attractive to behave in a corrupt way than the other way around. So as I said, corruption should not be an option anymore. There are some efficient international anti-corruption programs and agreements. So the international ones are the OECD Anti-Bribery Corruption and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption from 1999. And in Europe we also have several. We have the GRECO, it's from the Council of Europe, the Group of States Against Corruption. We have the Criminal Law Convention of Corruption, we have OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Corruption, and we have the Copenhagen criteria. So the Copenhagen criteria, these are the rules that also imply when a country wants to enter the European Union, that also the level of corruption should be very, very low. So this is also included in the Copenhagen criteria, and countries that are interested to become a member of the European Union need to prove that they do something against corruption, so that they fight corruption. We saw now that countries, before they want to enter the European Union, show lower levels of corruption. After some years, they entered the European Union, it increased again. So also the cost-benefit analysis is still not working there. The third argument, before I will talk about the culture argument, is the path dependency argument, or the historical argument, or as I call it, why legacies matter. So the path dependency argument is closely related also to the cultural argument, and implies that the persistence of corruption, of course, has historical roots. So corruption is not just appearing, there is a pathway behind that. And there are several explanations. The first one is from Aslan and Rothstein from 2016, based on a case study analysis, from comparative case study analysis, and they argue that corruption is deeply rooted in the underlying social and historical political structures of a country, and they found a strong relationship between the levels of mass education in the late 19th century and present-day corruption levels. And when we have a look at the Scandinavian countries, they had this. They had the mass education already in the 19th century, and these are also the countries that show low levels of corruption now. Another explanation is the duration of democracy. So the longer a country is a democracy, the lower the level of corruption. And Treisman was one of the first researchers who was working on this, who found out this relationship. And he found that states which had been democratic systems constantly since 1950 show lower degrees of corruption. But then we have Greece. So as you can see, these arguments, you always have to see it as a combination. It's not only about democracy, it's not only about sanction, it's not only about history or only about culture, it's the overall framework. And another explanation is the legacy of the country's communist past, especially when we have a look at Europe. So research shows that the legacy of a country's communist past in particular has a strong impact on a country's level of corruption. So in the case of post-communist countries, where corruption has been widely institutionalized over decades, corrupt practices are a cultural heritage. So it's still part of the people, it's still part in the institution, so it belongs to their daily life. And these corrupt practices have often become internalized in the action of individuals and in institutional bureaucracies, and of course we can change it only very, very slowly. So Sandwals and Hagebera suggest communism created structural incentives for engaging in corrupt behaviors, which became such a widespread fact of life that they became rooted in the culture in these societies. That is, the social norms and practices prevailing in communist societies. Okay, so now let's talk about the culture arguments or informal rules, and this is also the new book that I was working on with a colleague from Germany. So we have the democracy, we have the institutions, everything is actually there, we have the laws, but still we have a problem with corruption. And one good example is, for example, Uganda. Uganda has the perfect institutional framework against the fight of corruption, but we know Uganda has also one of the highest levels of corruption in the world. So there are some scholars that argue that the reason why some countries are more corrupt than others is that the public acceptance of what is commonly understood as corruption varies significantly across cultures. So this implies that what is considered as a bribe in a low-level corruption country might be considered as a present in a high-level corruption country. So the assumption is that corruption can flourish not because of weak institutions, but rather because of social norms, which provides incentives for individuals to be corrupt. So the culture argument implies that corruption is not only a crime of calculation, it's proposing a less rationalistic and less institutional approach. And here we also have several explanations, and then you can see how rich the research on corruption is. We have the collective action problem. We can also talk about integration into Western international networks and organizations, and about a democratic culture. So the collective action approach includes that corruption is an expected behavior and everyone expects everyone else to be corrupt. So although people really have a problem with corruption, and this we find in surveys all over the world, people reject corruption. They know it's a bad behavior, but they think because everyone else is doing this, so they would be the only stupid person who's not playing the game. So that's why they take part of the game, but we cannot change corruption, and we cannot lower the level of corruption. And this you can also apply to institutional corruption, as Thompson did it now in a new article. Even when you are part of an institution and you want to change the rules, you don't do it because you are not trusting the other people that are part of the game. And if we are not changing this, we cannot change the level of corruption also in institutions. Also because you always think that you then as a competitive disadvantage. So if you are not playing the rules, someone else would play the game and win it. And also, the higher up you are on a hierarchy, the less interested you may be in changing the system. So why should you change the rules when you're already part of this and it brings you there where you're then already? Another explanation is the integration into Western international networks and organizations, and this also refers to the European Union, because international organizations and institutions, they can also create economic as well as normative pressure. So if you want to be part of the European Union, you have to play the rules of the European Union, and one of the rules is that you have a low level of corruption, that you are fighting corruption. So these organizations are also helping in reducing the level of corruption. And the last point is the democratic culture. So about this I will talk now in more detail, that more advanced democratic structures create anti-corruption norms that lead to lower levels of corruption and vice versa. So in the end, this also shows that it's not only the national norms, so that the norms that you have within the society, also international norms. So we really need culture to change the level of corruption. Let's have a deeper look into the attitudes of Europeans towards corruption. So here you see the acceptability of corruption in Europe, and this is October 2017, so we have red, it means always acceptable. This is orange, rosé, sometimes acceptable. Blue means never, and gray means I don't know, and this is from 2013, so 4 years ago. And here you can see that 75%, the question is talking more generally, if you want to get something from the public administration or public service, to what extent do you think it is acceptable to do any of the followings? To do a favor, to give a gift, to give money. And here we see 75% saying it's not acceptable. But it doesn't really change 4 years ago. So here we have 75% and here we have 72%. So 3% during 4 years. And we see a similar result to give a gift, 76 to 76, there is no difference. And here to give money, 83% say it's never acceptable, and 4 years ago, 82. When we have a closer look into the countries for doing a favor, then again we see here, Denmark, 90% would say it's not acceptable, followed by Montenegro actually, and Spain, Sweden, Portugal. So they have high they are saying no, it's not acceptable. And here in the end, we see Hungary and Slovakia again. So only 39% or 40% say it's not acceptable. So here we see again differences between the north, between the south, between the east and the western countries, especially between Central and Eastern Europe and the north. So this is doing a favor. This is to give a gift. Again, Denmark on the top, 93%, followed by Finland and Portugal. And in the end, Hungary, only 39% saying it's acceptable. And this is the last one, to give money. In Spain and Portugal, they say here 93%, 94, 90, 90, 90, 90. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Luxembourg, France, and Montenegro. And here, Hungary, Latvia, Romania, Lithuania, Slovakia, also UK. 55% in Hungary, only half of them saying it's not acceptable. And this, of course, is related to culture and norms. Okay, so let's talk about the democratic culture, and then I'm almost done. So during my PhD and also after, based on the research for some other articles, I found that these factors influence corruption over time and also across European countries. So at first, economic development. Of course, we need a certain degree of economic development, otherwise it's not working. Then we have the problem with need and greed corruption anymore, so that people are so poor that they really have to bribe. So of course, the GDP is very important. International integration, as I said, countries that are member of the European Union, they show lower levels of corruption, but it depends. So there are countries that increased again. Degree of democracy, this is the democracy argument. Women's percentage in parliaments. And this is another huge topic, because I'm also working on corruption and gender. Because I'm really skeptical that women are less corrupt than men. Protestantism, but this is related to interpersonal trust, because countries that have high levels of Protestantism also have high levels of interpersonal trust. I will show you illustrations soon. And historical factors such as the duration of democracy and post-communist past. So all of these factors, except post-communist past, show a negative relationship. So the higher the level of democracy, the more women are in parliaments, the longer a country is already democracy, the lower the level of corruption. And countries that have a post-communist past show higher levels of corruption. So here we have the path dependency argument again. But interpersonal trust is really important. So we see a negative relationship between interpersonal trust and corruption. And when you have here, look again at the data, this is from the European Social Service. So people were asked if you trust, how high is your interpersonal trust level? And there, I think, new data is now was just published now. We see here again Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland. So the level of personal trust, interpersonal trust, 0 means low and 10 means high. So the countries that show high levels of interpersonal trust are also the countries that show lower levels of corruption. And there's also a lot of research about that, because you would actually think, yeah, but I need high interpersonal trust to bribe someone, so that I can be sure that the other one is accepting my bribe, so that we are trusting each other. But it's the other way around. People don't trust in these high-level interpersonal trust countries because I know it's bad for the society. So countries such as Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they have this high level of interpersonal trust, and I know it would destroy the community, the feeling or the solidarity if they would bribe. And then, because maybe some people are interested in that, and also because I'm in this new project now on corruption and state capture in Central and Eastern Europe. I want to just very quickly, gender norms. Marie Götz called it already in 2007, there's a move making behind that. So because everybody is thinking now, yeah, we just need more women and then the problem is fixed. And the women are not the key to success, so to say, because there is now not a lot, but there are some articles that show, for example, also Monika Bauer, who showed this distinction between need and greed corruption. They did an analysis in France over time, and they saw that people who are coming into the position, they behaved less corrupt than men when you compare the behavior, but after some time, they were adjusted to their rules, to their position, and they behaved exactly in the same way. So they were not less corrupt, let's call it like this. And also this bribery games that I conducted, what I said in Israel, in Germany, and the US, I didn't find differences between the corrupt behavior of men and women. Just the women who bribed, they gave more reasons. They gave more arguments. Why did they do this justification argument? But in the end, we didn't find any differences between men and women. So actually, this is related to norms of equality and norms of diversity. So countries where we have a higher number of women in parliaments, these countries also have higher norms for equality and diversity. So it's not all about the women. Would be nice, but... Okay, summary and conclusion. As I said, it's very important to research on corruption in Europe because we have a variety of corruption. We have several forms. We have different levels of corruption. We have the north, which show lower levels of corruption than the south, and so on. And also, it's not about the hardware of democracy, it's also about the informal rules. It's about the norms and the values that we need to change if we want to have lower levels of corruption. I call it democratic culture. It means fighting corruption consists of the combination of formal democratic institutions that provide transparency, accountability, trust, pluralism, and informal rules, but also include mechanisms that allow for the monitoring and sanctioning of corrupt actors. Of course, we need more social empowerment, we need more education, we need stronger citizens, active journalists that are fighting against corruption, so we need a norm and value-based corruption control. And to give some future prospects, we need more area and culture-specific knowledge about corruption. We need more case studies, so we need to go into the countries. So the factors that I presented you, like the democracy argument, for example, this is a general relationship. So this works all over the world. But we know, I mentioned Greece, it depends. So we have to combine general approaches with more case-specific analysis to find the mechanisms of corruption. And I would love to talk more about the case studies that we did in Central and Eastern Europe, in Romania, Czech Republic, and Hungary, what we found out there. We need more research. What does it mean, democratic culture? So we have to go deeper into this. And also, what are actually anti-corruption norms? So are there any corruption norms? How can we define them? How can we characterize them? Yeah, and this is my last slide. So this is from the United Nations and the UNESCO. And their approach is to give more education. So that's why I'm also involved in this development of anti-corruption models that should be, they plan that researchers or academics teach more on anti-corruption at universities. So we are working on this now. My model is corruption and comparative politics. And they use always this picture to change norms on corruption. תודה רבה.